afternoon. My name is Kevin Kelleher, and I'm with Activate Networks, and here to introduce Mike Dulworth in our next session on how do senior executives best access business intelligence and learn in a VUCA world. And I was just talking with Mike about my needing to look up VUCA, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguity. And the skill set that is important for those executives to navigate the world today, and then network acumen. Mike is the CEO of Executive Networks. And Executive Networks is a leading provider of peer-to-peer networks for HR professionals and large organizations worldwide. His most recent books are The Connect Effect, Building Strong Personal, Professional, and Virtual Networks, and Strategic Executive Development, The 5 Essential Investments. Mike has a BA from the University of Michigan and an MPA from USC, and I'm happy to introduce Mike.
Thank you very much. So I'm here because of Rob, so this is his fault. So I met Rob a number of years ago. He actually came and spoke to one of my networks, the Chief Learning Officer Network, and I was just really captured by his work and the stuff that he was producing, and we've stayed in touch for years and years now. But I wanted to give you a little bit of context around who Executive Networks is, just because everything I say is really built on the experience that I've had building this company and running this company. So we're based in San Francisco. We create these, what I call executive peer networks, and I'll define that a little bit more because I think it's important, the words that make up that phrase, if you will, executive, peer, and networks all together, and what that really means. But we focus on global 2,000 companies. We have 16 networks now. Our sort of concept has been to become sort of the biggest and the best in HR executive peer networks for large corporations. And then once we've sort of figured out how to do this, and it's been sort of an exploration for us. We didn't sort of nail it right out of the box, and we've been iterating ever since. We're then moving into other basically corporate functions, things like IT executives, marketing executives, legal executives, finance executives is our business model. But the whole idea, we have like a chief HR officer network. Actually, we have 3 of them, so we have about 100 of the global 1,000 chief HR officers in our network. And then we have networks for the layer below the chief HR officer, so heads of talent, heads of learning, heads of HRIS, that kind of thing. And sort of the idea behind these networks is you have your home network. If you're the chief learning officer for Merck or something like that, you'd be in a network with 40 or so of your peers from other companies of like size, and that's an important thing. So peers is important, as I mentioned. So people that do exactly what you do in a similar sized company. They are executives, and you're in a network together. And we find that this combination of peer executive network is really what drives the value around what we do. So the other thing that, the reason I'm here, I guess, really, is that we're going to be working with Rob, and we're going to be working with Activate Networks to form what you've seen in your, I think, your flyer, the Network Roundtable. And I'm very, very excited about this. I think of it as a network for people that are into networks and just mashing up a bunch of people that are into networks, but from all different perspectives. They have all different interests. They think about networks in all different kinds of ways. And we're going to put, 60 or 100 companies together that are interested in networks and see where that takes us over the next few years. Rob had a network like this at the University of Virginia, and for a number of different reasons it sort of dissolved, and we're going to bring it back to life with Rob and Activate Networks. So we have a meeting scheduled in Washington later this year, and there'll be like interest groups that'll form out of it too, a little bit like you're seeing here in this session, but it will be an ongoing network. It'll be an ongoing group where people will get together a couple times a year to really go deep on these topics. Okay, so I wrote a book at the beginning of 2008 called The Connect Effect, and I was looking at, what do these networks do for individuals, not just executives, but for sort of anybody, students, mothers, just anybody, in terms of how can you build and manage and grow your network. And I really think that this idea of networking is very exponential, right? It's the network effect. It's the thing that we just saw and heard at lunch, right? The 1 + 1 really equals 4. And I came up with this sort of algorithm around success that I think is, I don't know if it's unique, but this idea of the networking quotient. So much like you have an intelligence quotient, you know, your cognitive ability to learn, I find that, or my belief is that's somewhat set, right? So you're sort of born, you have, you know, this sort of an innate ability to learn, right? And so you can't do a whole heck of a lot about that, but to learn, to go to school, to do those things, and I suppose, you know, you can develop your brain in various ways. But your EIQ, your emotional intelligence quotient, is, I think, something that you can actually do something about, that you have some ability to know yourself better, right, to grow emotionally, you know, to behave in certain ways. And so I think that there's a lot of things you can actually do here that matters a lot in terms of success. And then I think of the networking quotient as sort of like the turbocharger for that. So if you're, you know, a decently bright person and you have a good emotional intelligence quotient, you can turbocharge that effect through having a great network. But how do you do that? And so that's what really my business is about, and what, you know, somewhat of what we're talking about here. So, you know, I was thinking, well, you know, I have a personal reason. I run a business that sort of does this. You know, why do you need to believe me about this sort of thing? So I went and found some other you know, some evidence, if you will, that, you know, networks really matter. And so this is the Corporate Leadership Council. This just came out recently. This is the Corporate Executive Board, if you know of them in a different word, but this is their HR organization that they have. But they did work around global leaders. And as you can see here, they really found that networks are a big driver of creating a great global leader. If you're not out there in the marketplace, if you're not talking to the right people and the right organizations and getting access to the right business intelligence, then you really cannot become a great global leader. So that's one data point, I think, that supports this premise. The other is, of course, Rob, and he talked a little bit about this today in his talk earlier today. But he's written a couple of BR articles and some other articles and books around this idea of networks being really key to the acceleration of leaders when they're in the high potential stage, right? And so we work with some of these leaders in that context. And then, you know, from Craig, from CCL, you know, we saw this in his card deck too, the card deck of connecting. And if you go to the back, a lot of what they're talking about there is really what I'm talking about too. So let me delve into this maybe a little bit in more detail. Let me go to a different presentation that I'm going to bring up here. And so I work, you know, with executives in large corporations. And, you know, this is the question that, you know, I think is sort of central to what they're dealing with day to day. I find that executives in today's business environment are really stressed, are very busy, are overloaded, and I think the recession actually has just exacerbated this, right? So companies have not been hiring. I think people are doing 2 and 3 jobs. What used to be 2 and 3 jobs is now being done by one person. So I think that they have basically no time to learn, right? Except what they learn sort of on the job in the throes of their daily work. They have no time to step back. They have no time to decompress. They have no time to disconnect. So they have no time to learn. And so I think that this is really one of our major problems that we have in large organizations especially. And as you know, we were talking about earlier, and I picked this up from Bob Johansen, and I think he picked it up from the US military, this idea of the VUCA world. And I think that this is, you know, the situation that we're in. This is our reality. And so what do you do about it, right? How can you help busy executives form and manage and get access to the types of information that they need, the type of thought leadership, the type of knowledge that they need to do their job day to day? Okay, so where do you turn for clarity? And this is, I think, a good example of that, right? So you took time out of your busy schedules to come to this event. But there's also associations, there's academic research, there's best practices, social media, of course, and consultants. But where is, maybe the best place or one of the best places to turn for clarity and to turn for really great knowledge and information? And, I know it's in my interest to say this, but I have to say I've found that this idea of turning to your peers is really one of the best sources for really what I call real-time business intelligence and thought leadership and new ideas. So these people have, in a sense, no skin in the game. If we go back to the previous slide, right, consultants have a point of view they're trying to get across. They're trying to sell you something, right? Associations, same sort of thing. They all have, these ulterior motives for presenting you with certain types of information or getting you involved in certain things. And I'm not saying they're bad, just saying you have to look behind the covers a little bit. When you get to your peers, what I've found, when we put these people together into a confidential, high-trust forum, like a small room, and we're around a U-shaped table or around a round table, it's amazing to me how fast these people connect, because they do the exact same things every day, and they're dealing with, pretty much the exact same problems. And so they, let their hair down, and they open up, and they start sharing things, not just about, best practices and, what worked, but really more importantly, what didn't work, and what were the issues and challenges that they faced, and how did they navigate, through that complexity in their own context. And I find that that's really, where the solid information is, the solid knowledge really resides, is opening up those conversations within this kind of trusted peer environment. But again, going back to that idea of peer, I think is really important, because if you're the chief HR officer of Shell, for example, who's a client of ours, there's only certain things that he's going to talk about with his CEO or the board, right? There's only certain things that he's going to talk about with his peers, the other C-level executives. And there's certainly only certain things that he's going to talk about with subordinates. But I think when you put them into this kind of a peer environment, so he's just sitting around the table with 20 other chief HR officers from large, complex organizations, I think the dynamic is one in which they'll really share, and they'll really get deep on things that they wouldn't normally talk about. No notes, what stays in Las Vegas, or what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas, that kind of thing. It's really an environment of high trust. So we think that this concept of real-time business intelligence is critical. Our networks have these peer executives in the network. They have subject matter experts, and then they have thought leaders. So the subject matter experts would be, for example, former executives of. So a lot of our networks have a former CHRO as part of the network to be there and be kind of the been there, done that people, if you will. The other thing that we find with these kinds of networks is, as I mentioned, these executives have no time. So how do you create a network environment that delivers value for people that have no time? So one, they have no time to form a network themselves, really. So we create an instantaneous network for them, right? So it pre-exists, they drop in, they're in a network of 30 or 40 of their peers. So that's high value for time. But then even if they have that network in place, how do they get access to the knowledge and intelligence in that network, right? So they can come to a face-to-face meeting. We have those, but that's only one way that they can derive value. So what we've figured out is that we have to provide what I call a very high-tech, high-touch environment for this type of interaction with these busy executives. And one of the main ways that we do that is through what we call community connection directors. So you might think of them as like network managers. And so what they are is like a concierge service. They're an agent, if you will, between the network member and the value that they can derive through the network. They're a conduit to the value. And so when an executive says, I have this issue, I have this challenge, I need access to this kind of information, they sort of jump into gear, tap into the network, what I call the collective knowledge and intelligence in the network, and they extract that information or that knowledge, and then they present that back to them. So it may be through peer connections, just simply putting 2 or 4 or 5 people together into a conversation. They organize that, right? Again, high value for time. Or they go find examples of information or knowledge in the network that exists in kind of the collective database. They extract that and they provide it back to the network member. So I think that it's really critical because these things, like I join, LinkedIn groups, right? I delete them. Every time it comes up in my email, I delete them. I just have no time to navigate them and to figure out where the value in the information is. I'm sure there's some there, but to get to it, I think is really, really difficult and really time consuming, and I just don't have the time, and I would pretend that, busy executives don't have the time either. And then I think that the other thing that these networks can do is really get access to what people are doing today and what people are planning to do in the future. And that's the real interesting knowledge, right? That's the real valuable knowledge, because what they've done in the past isn't all that relevant. I'm not a big fan, honestly, of best practices and best practice research, because of its inherent nature, it's about the past. You're documenting the past. And what's really valuable in this VUCA world, right, where things are changing and it's so dynamic, is what people are doing today, how they're reacting to that VUCA world, and what they're going to be doing about that in the future. And I would propose to you that the only way, really one of the only ways you can get access to that real-time business intelligence is through these types of networks, is through these types of facilitated networks like the Network Roundtable will be. It'll be an example of that. We'll have conversations about what people are doing today with these networks and what they're planning to do 3 months, 6 months out, and then we'll come back 3 months or 6 months from that point, and we'll have discussions about what they've done and what they've learned, and that'll cascade and grow and grow and grow. So just to stop real quick, any questions, any comments, any thoughts about this so far? If it's a face-to-face meeting, so let's say they join, in September and we have a meeting in October, and so they come and they have the face-to-face meeting. It's, as I mentioned, it's almost instantaneous. As soon as they get around the table, and we have a couple things almost like icebreakers that we do, sort of some fun techniques to get people to share something about themselves, right, to kind of lower the stress level and communicate to their peers. And it's around connecting, and Rob would know this. It's like, do you have children? Well, yes, I have children. And that creates a connection, and then you start talking. Or I grew up in the Midwest. Oh, you grew up in the Midwest. So, it starts with the very mundane at some level, but then it very quickly moves to those things that are really relevant and important for why they're there to begin with. In a virtual context, I would say it takes much longer. So without the face-to-face, I think that the virtual context takes a lot longer to build that trust. Because, basically you're just seeing names, you're hearing things, names in a teleconference, a knowledge share, those kinds of things. And we do all of those things. But I just think people are much less willing to deeply share in a virtual environment than they are in a face-to-face environment. Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead. The way in which we're structured is that we have one community connection director for every network. So a network would have between 30 and 50 members, and we would have one full-time community connection director per really 2 networks. So it's sort of like 70-80 is about what we've found that they can handle. And they are full-time, and this is the only thing that they do. So they're really critical. And then we have these subject matter experts, what we call executive directors, and they're a big part of the network. They usually facilitate the meetings, because if you think about getting executives around a round table, you could have a super facilitator do that, but is it better to have somebody who's been in their job, sat in their seat, has that kind of instant credibility with them? It's a different type of facilitation of the dialogue from really a knowledge base versus I'm just a good facilitator. So they're in the networks. And then the other people that we have, we call them academics or thought leaders in residence. It's people like Rob and Peter who are sort of assigned to a network, and they actually become a member of the network per se for like a year period, and they come to the meetings. Now they may present, may not, but they're really a network member. And so anything that's going on in the network, like in the online dialogue and that sort of stuff, they're commenting on stuff. They're really participating as a member. So that sort of gets us from this, the connectivity to the real-time business intelligence to the thought leadership and new ideas, all kind of bundled and facilitated together. So this is the concept that I was talking about earlier. I think that, in the executive world, there's just too much here. Right? There's just, as we all, data overload, information overload. It's not really what helps executives make decisions and be effective. It's how do you get over to the knowledge and even, the wisdom aspect of what we're doing. I mean, I think there are some, sort of central truths that exists out there that if we can get access to it, it's really helpful. So this is the Community Connection Director, and these are the things that they do. Right? So they organize the virtual meetings, the teleconferences, they create the connectivity. So they almost every about 4 months, they'll connect with a member, they'll interview the member about their needs and their challenges, and they'll document that, and then they'll go into the network and find things that they think would be relevant to them. But again, they're on the lookout too, right? So it's not just a one-time delivery. They're always on the lookout as things come through the network. And I think the network has a big database, right, with almost like a ticker tape, running through it of information and knowledge. So they're extracting stuff, as they see it cut across the network and then delivering that to the network member. So that's what they do over here. Then the executive directors and the academics and resources are really, or academics and residents are really, mentoring. They're being part of the live meetings, and they're subject matter experts. And now we're starting to do more and more up here on the technology side. Especially what we found is that after 9/11 and then after the recession, is that executives were really pressed around travel. So we've seen our participation in our meetings go from probably 50% participation to more like 40%, maybe even 30%. People are they have travel restrictions, right? They really have to work other meetings around these kinds of meetings. So we're now doing 2-year calendars so people can get it on their calendar, all of that type of stuff. So we think that in the, now and into the future, this will be more important. But what we also find is, these are VP level and above kind of executives. This is not where they live. Right? They fundamentally live in an email world. They really aren't comfortable, with collaboration tools. They don't work in a virtual way very effectively. So, we're kind of going slow here, quite honestly, and we're just starting to build a new social network platform, I guess you would call it. And we'll see how that works with this executive group, because I think they're very different in some ways, and maybe we'll push a whole bunch out over the next few years and get a different generation in. But at least the ones that are there now, that are in their mid 40s to 60s, are not that technically competent. And so, I'm just going to sum up quickly here. Here's what we think are the outcomes of this kind of networking. Again, these peer executive networks. So we think that they can accelerate innovation, because that's what these people care about, right? They're not just managing the status quo. They're trying to figure out how to do things better, more efficiently, more effectively. That's why they're in these jobs. And so if they can get access to other executives that have the same challenge and learn collaboratively with them, we think that they can accelerate what they're doing and be more efficient and effective. of course, stay current and avoid pitfalls. The lessons learned, here's what, the mistake was, here's how I fixed it, those kinds of things. This is something I was reading Reid Hoffman's book about the startup of you, and he has something similar to this, but this is kind of my take on it. You to the power of 50. It's sort of like if I'm the chief talent officer for Cisco, and I want to join a network like this, and I have to go present this to my boss, and our networks cost $12,500 a year, so they're not, an insignificant investment. And it's just for that executive. It's not for their team or anything. It's just for that executive. Then, we thought that the value proposition might be you to the power of 50. So you get into a network of 50 of your peers. And so, they've hired you to be the chief talent officer. So I know they expect you to know everything, right? You're supposed to be the expert. But at the end of the day, you don't. But now you have access to 50 people that are really just like you. And you think about that. If they were if they had sort of experience of 25 years, right, that's, I think, 1,250 years of experience that they're tapping into through the network, which is pretty extraordinary. So we see a lot of, things tactically, in the networks. I need, to find out about this, or I need to vet this consultant, or I need, different things. Like when the recession happened, there was a huge dialogue in the network around how to cut costs without cutting people, which I thought was very interesting. Of course, these are HR people, so they are, it's not the first place they go, but, they were really working very hard at sharing things around how they could cut costs without cutting their workforces. So that was something that came up. We have all kinds of sort of personal effectiveness type things in the network too. So it's not just about networking, but how you can grow as a leader, how you can grow as a person. So there's an aspect of this, built in. There's a new book, I don't know if you've seen it, on positive intelligence. A guy by the name of Shirzad, and he just spoke to one of our networks. So there is some element of that. And then, there is something about advancing the field. We had a whole dialogue last year with our talent executives around the future of talent management, really kind of looking out 10 years. And we held 2 special meetings of a very select group of chief talent officers. And then we had a virtual dialogue around that. We've produced some papers and some teleconferences and some things out of that. And it was pretty provocative, quite frankly, and that was the whole point. So trying to sort of not just accept the status quo and what you do in these jobs, but try to push the envelope a little and to have a conversation among yourselves around it. So, and I just wanted to leave you with this, because really this was from my book, and actually I was reading some of Rob's stuff too, just kind of preparing again, and there's some parallels like around diversity of your network, for example, which honestly I put it at 9, and this is the David Letterman list, going from 10 to 1, but I would put it way down here actually now, based on sort of this last 4 or 5 years of my experience. I think that having diverse networks is really a super big key. I also think that this concept of building your personal board of directors is very powerful. So it's just like a company board of directors, but this is a board of directors for you personally, and you invite people, you select them, you invite them, you tell them what it's about. They accept or don't accept. You keep them for a while. You may, ask them to leave, as your life changes, as your career changes. But this idea that you have 6 or 8 people who really deeply care about you professionally, personally, however you're building it and making it an overt thing that you do, not just, oh, I have some people out there that sometimes I tap into. They really become your team. There was a book written, Who's Got Your Back? Right? And I think, these are, if you build one overtly, like I suggest, these people can really have your back in this whole area of your own, success, your own personal development. So, questions? So, no. But we could. That's the thing about these networks, is you can slice and dice them a million different ways. So we actually do, like we have a very large North American talent management network, and in that we have a financial services subgroup, because sort of post-recession, they're dealing with some issues, related to, the Dodd bill and different ways that they have to operate. And so they wanted to have their own conversation. So that we've had, where we have basically sub-networks or interest groups, to Rob's point, that form, but we haven't created industry-specific networks. What we find, again, to this point of diversity, that this cross-industry model is really effective for what we're trying to do. Not that the industry one can't be effective either. I think it can. I sense that you would have a different conversation in that network than you would have in a cross-industry. And, they're both good, but we are really in this kind of cross-industry space. So I bought a company called Executive Development Associates back in 2004, and they had a couple of these peer networks on the side of the business, just as kind of a fun thing to do for the founder of this business. I used to work for the conference board out of New York and ran a couple of their councils, and so I had some experience with it. So we started really kind of focusing on that. So it started with, executive development, leadership development, learning, and then it cascaded. But we did want to create what we call a constellation of networks, because again, this idea that you have your home, but nobody works in isolation, and even in HR, right? So you have some silos, but really what you want is people collaborating. So we think of the network model as being one where, there's the individual, and there's stuff to focus the individual on. There's the network, and there's stuff that happens within the network context. There's the cluster, and that's putting multiple networks together and what you can do with that around knowledge and information sharing. And then there's the constellation. There's the whole network. And so we do certain activities and try to extract knowledge and information from all of those different buckets, if you will. So sometimes we do surveys across all 250 of our companies, and then share that with all networks. If there's an issue that 3 of the networks are most interested in, or is germane to 3 of the networks, we'll put those networks together to have a conversation around that topic. So now we are, though, since we feel like we've sort of perfected this model to some degree, we're now moving into, as I mentioned first early on, other corporate functions, because we think it's the same. It doesn't matter if it's legal, finance, marketing. The model that we've created transcends that and can be just as effective in any corporate function. One is when we ask them what their challenges are, what their issues are, when we kind of interview them, we also formally ask them what their offers are. And what we mean by that is, what are those areas that they're willing to share? What do they feel like they've done some good work in? What are they proud of? That kind of thing. And when you put it into that context, it kind of removes any of the stigma behind it, in a negative sense. And I think that it brings people forth. But, as Rob knows, in his, network analysis, you have lurkers, right? You have the knowledge nodes, you have the sharers, there's just people have a different network topology, is that the right word? I don't know, or typology, right? And so, you have to work within that. And there's another card in the CCL thing, it was weaving. That's what the community connection directors do. They understand their network profile of all their different members, and they're weaving people, together in different ways. But you have people that are incredible givers, and you have people that really just sit on the sidelines and are takers. And it's not that, one's bad or one's good. You could be introverted and you could be extroverted, or you could, be somebody who's self-promoting and you're not self-promoting, right? So you have all of those personal dynamics that within the context of the network you have to manage. But I think by just simply asking, you create a safe place for people, at least to dip their finger in and say, I'm really proud of this thing that I designed, and I'll talk about that in the network. And then if they share that and get some kind of positive reinforcement, and especially, sort of the quid pro quo starts appearing, right? So we always say you get what you give. And so giving is good, right? The more you give within the context of the network, the more you're going to get back, because people are going to remember that you gave. And then when you ask your question, people will remember that and really, come back and give you, your payback for that effort in a sense. Any other final questions? I think we're wrapping up. Okay, well, thank you very much.